Welcome to the newest episode of Beatin' and Bangin'. I'm your host, Kyle Dalton. We've got some interesting stories to cover in this midweek edition, including Denny Hamlin making a second bold prediction in as many days. But this one won't make Darlington fans happy. We also have a story on the charter talks heating up, including an interesting proposal by the France family. We had a first this week in the latest TV ratings, and I'll tell you why it's no time for NASCAR fans to panic. Plus, in our By the Numbers segment, we have some changing at the top in our last 5 races analysis. I've also had some fun doing a driver comparisons of multiple drivers through the season's first dozen races. However, before we get to those numbers, first let's go back to Monday and Denny Hamlin's Actions Detrimental podcast. The Joe Gibbs racing driver talked about the wild and controversial ending in Kansas, including his view of the closest finish in NASCAR Cup Series history. That also included a discussion on the controversial topic of the painted line and it being so crooked. Near the end of the episode, the 3-time Daytona 500 champion, who had made a bold prediction the day before at the urging of Clint Bowyer that he was going to win the championship in 2024, shifted his attention toward the next race at Darlington and Throwback Weekend, and then made an unexpected prediction about the race's future.
The throwback thing's kind of lost its luster, in my opinion, and especially when teams are throwing back to different eras. I don't know. It's almost a little confusing to me more than it is anything. It was really cool the first year that everyone kind of bought in, and it was very similar to eras and when certain decade, but it's all kind of all over the board now. So I'd be surprised if this goes past this year. For sure.
Taking a 30,000-foot view, it does appear, as Hamlin suggested, there might be some drop-off in participation by teams and drivers in 2024. But I don't know if that means it's going away as Hamlin believes. I guess time will tell. Moving on to our next story and some charter talk. Last week, I had the Athletics' Jeff Gluck on the channel, and we discussed his detailed article on the charters that he co-wrote with Jordan Bianchi. Gluck talked about how NASCAR CEO Jim France was taking a divide-and-conquer approach, avoiding talking with the Race Team Alliance or RTA and its team negotiating committee, but instead visiting with individual teams and getting their thoughts about the situation. This week's discussions on charter negotiations are brought to you by Adam Stern of the Sports Business Journal. In the latest article, Stern talked about the 4 pillars of the charter agreement, which Gluck also detailed and include a 45% of traditional media revenue, 33% of new revenue, greater governance powers, and of course, the permanent charters. But Stern also brought up something not publicly discussed in the past, and that was NASCAR talked about the possibility of altering a clause in the charter system that prevents a family member of the owners of NASCAR from becoming a competitor and acquiring an equity stake in a team. This would allow France or another family member to reap the benefits of the gains seen in the charter system, which has increased dramatically in the last several years. The current agreement states that NASCAR agrees that neither it or any family relative of the owners of NASCAR will acquire a direct or indirect interest in a team if that relative is involved in the active management of NASCAR holdings. And then the veteran journalist included an interesting example, suggesting former CEO Brian France, who is no longer an employee at NASCAR Holdings, would be free to buy a charter under these new terms. Stern said teams have been hesitant to embrace the proposal due to fear that it could undermine the integrity of the sport. The latest report also said the topic of altering that clause hasn't been discussed in a while. And finally, the last piece of information from that article that I think was noteworthy is Stern said that NASCAR recently told the teams that they can expect to see a full version of the offer in the coming weeks. I know I've been keeping an eye on it and will continue to do so in the coming days ahead. Based on what the report said, we might have a better understanding of what's happening with the charter negotiations in the next month or so. Moving on to our next topic, and that was the NASCAR television ratings that came out on Tuesday. 2.29 million tuned in for the rain-delayed Cup Series race on Sunday, which was down 2% from the 2.35 million that watched in 2023. Well, that's not necessarily a surprise considering it was rain-delayed and on FS1. But the numbers are definitely receiving more attention simply because of the F1 ratings. According to ESPN, ABC set a record with an average of 3.1 million viewers watching the Miami race. The tape coverage of the 2002 Monaco race was the previous best at 2.78 million, while the previous high for a live race occurred during the inaugural Miami event in 2022 with 2.58 million. Last year's rating saw a significant drop to 1.96 million, or a 24% decline. This year's F1 numbers are a 48% jump in viewers from 2023 and almost a 20% increase over 2022. So naturally, some of those in the NASCAR Sky is Always Falling category took to social media and talked about how F1 had surpassed NASCAR. What they failed to mention was the reasons why it happened. One of the biggest contributing factors was the rain delay of 3 hours, which allowed many NASCAR fans like myself, and like I mentioned in my last video, to flip over to ABC and watch that race knowing full well that when it ended, I would still be able to catch the entire Cup Series race. Another reason for increased viewership for F1 this year specifically was Lando Norris won. You might think, but that was after the fact. Well, during the race, and I know because I saw it, people were talking on social media about the Brit taking the lead and how he might potentially earn his first win. Well, he did. And another really important reason that the F1 broadcast received higher ratings was because of its lead-in, which was the first round Game 7 of the NBA playoffs between the Orlando Magic and Cleveland Cavaliers, which had an average of 4.32 million viewers. And again, NASCAR was aired on FS1 and had no notable lead-in. So as much as some fans on social media are pushing the panic button and suggesting F1 is better than NASCAR, they can certainly make that claim for the May 5th races based on the size of the television viewing audiences. However, that's not painting a complete picture of why it happened. But, as they say, why let the truth get in the way of a good story? Speaking of numbers, it's time for this week's By the Numbers segment. Let's start with our last 5 races, and you'll see sitting at the top for a second consecutive week is Chase Elliott, again followed by Tyler Reddick, Kyle Larson, and Martin Truex Jr. Those were the same top 4 in last week's analysis. What's interesting is to see that Elliott has improved his average finishing position while Reddick's decreased by 2 full spots to 8.6. Kyle Larson also improved with his win, and Martin Truex stayed steady at 10.0. But the rest of the top 10 is almost completely different than it was last week. Noah Gragson comes in at number 5 at 11.2 and moves up from his 7th position of a week ago with 11.8. Kyle Busch is 6th in this week's last 5 analysis with an average finishing position of 12.8, an improvement of almost 3 spots from last week's 15.2. Alex Bowman has moved up from 10th to 7th in this week's numbers with an average finishing position of 13 even. William Byron takes the biggest hit in the top 10, dropping from 5th and 10.2 last week to 8th and 13.4 this week. Chase Briscoe drops a position to 9th at 13.6, and the top 10 is rounded out by Brad Keselowski for a second week in a row at 13.8. Last week he came in at 13.2. And the last thing in this week's By the Numbers segment is we'll take a look at some driver comparisons. Let's start off with Hendrick Motorsports. And I think one of the first things that sticks out to me is the number of top 5s by Kyle Larson, which is the best in the Cup Series at 6. Coming in at number 2 in the Cup Series top 5 finishes is his HMS teammate, Chase Elliott. Interestingly, William Byron and Alex Bowman are tied with multiple other drivers at 4 apiece. The difference is Byron's top 5s include 3 victories. Bowman's best finish was at the season opening race at Daytona, where he finished 2nd to Byron. I think it's also worth noting, as our last 5 race analysis shows, Chase Elliott outside of Talladega has been pretty damn impressive with all those top 5 finishes coming in the last 6 races. Moving on to the other big team, Joe Gibbs Racing. And Denny Hamlin's 3 wins are obviously notable, but I also respect the consistency of Martin Truex Jr. with no finishes outside of the top 20, and his worst result an 18th at Martinsville. Christopher Bell turned it around last week at Kansas, and he needed it, after 3 finishes of 34th or worse over the last 4 weeks. And rounding out the JGR stable is Ty Gibbs, who started off the 2024 campaign strong, but he has tapered off here lately, including suffering his worst finish of the season at Kansas, finishing 32nd. Let's check out another 4-car team in Stewart-Haas Racing, and you can see in the last 3 weeks, Josh Berry has been pretty consistent on 3 different types of tracks. However, Noah Gragson is clearly the best of the bunch for the season and in the last 3 races with 3 top 10s in that span. Chase Briscoe has also had a pretty solid start to the first dozen races of the season, with 3 top 10s and only a single finish of 30th or worse. Ryan Preece had a pretty good 3-race stretch from Martinsville to Talladega, but has struggled in the last few weeks with his 2 worst finishes of the season. Taking a look at some other Fords that includes a combined 4 championships between 3 of the drivers, Brad Keselowski in the first 12 races has been on a roller coaster of a ride. Starting with a pair of 33rd place finishes to open the season, he suffered another 33rd place at COTA, but has recorded a couple of runner-up finishes at Texas and Talladega. Ryan Blaney, outside of a couple of poor performances at Daytona and Texas, has also been fairly consistent, with 4 top 5s and 5 top 10s, including his most recent top 10, a 7th at Dover. Chris Buescher will forever be remembered for winning the Kansas race. Finishing second at the Kansas race. But you can see his performance at Kansas put an end to a negative trend for the number 17 team in recent weeks of progressively getting worse. And rounding out the Fords is Joey Logano, who is probably one of the biggest surprises of the year with a single top 5 and just 3 top 10s. He has the same number of finishes outside of the top 30. And our last driver comparison is a mixture of drivers, including Ross Chastain, Kyle Busch, Carson Hocevar, and Daniel Suarez. Chastain started out the season strong with 4 top 10s in the first 6 races, but has cooled off in recent weeks and hasn't had a top 10 since COTA, or in the last 6 races. Kyle Busch, on the other hand, finished 3rd in the second race of the year at Atlanta and then posted some lackluster performances. But in the last 4 races, he has 3 top 10s, including a 4th place at Dover. Carson Hocevar is clearly in the front for Rookie of the Year honors, and his numbers prove why. Outside of that season-opening 40th place finish at Daytona, the young driver has finished every single race higher than 27th, including his best finish of the year at Texas, where he finished 10th. And rounding out our drivers in our driver comparison is Daniel Suarez. Just comparing him to his teammate Ross Chastain, you can see that Suarez has 2 top 5s versus Chastain's 1, including his win at Atlanta. But outside of those 2 performances and an 11th at Las Vegas, the number 99 team has struggled. All right, guys, that's a wrap on this episode. I want to get your thoughts on all of it. Do you like Throwback Weekend at Darlington, and do you think it's coming back next year? What do you think of all the charter talk and NASCAR's proposal of modifying that clause that would allow them to own a team? And tell me what you think of those television ratings. I think it's good for F1, but it doesn't mean what a lot of those doom and gloomers think it means. And lastly, what do you think about our By the Numbers segment, including the last 5 races analysis and our driver comparisons? Any surprises for you in there? Remember, if you want to read my written work, go check it out at heavy.com and beatingandbanging.com, where you can also sign up for my weekly email newsletter, and you'll receive an email each Friday recapping the top stories from the week, including reviews of the various NASCAR-related podcasts. Also, make sure to check out my Beating and Banging podcast on the Blue Wire Network. Thanks as always for supporting the channel. I really appreciate it, and have a great rest of your day.